Prospect Park Zoo in Brooklyn was once on the list for the top 10 worst zoos in America. The animals were kept in small cages or in pit-style enclosures. They were offered little stimulation or environmental enrichment, but provided entertainment for the thousands of visitors that had entered its gates since the 1930s. In May 1987, just as the zoo closed up for the day, 3 young boys walked around its perimeter. They were on a mission, a mischievous mission that was both exciting and adventurous, but it was also dangerous. They planned to sneak into the zoo and swim around the seal moat. It was a silly dare the 10 and 11-year-olds had come up with, though it would be one that would cost one of them his life. The security team began their patrol, and the night watchman on duty paced near the zoo's entrance. But the boys had found another way in. A small hole in the perimeter fencing was just big enough for the youngsters to crawl through. They knelt down, hardly daring to breathe as they tugged at the fencing a little. Then they pulled themselves through on their tummies and stepped inside. All was quiet. A few workers remained on site, but the hustle and bustle from the visiting public had died down now. The boys made their way to the seal enclosure, but on the way, they spotted something else. Another enclosure, the polar bear exhibit. This also had a moat around it, but this one was far more dangerous. It was far more exciting for the 3 young boys. They dared each other to climb in and swim around the polar bear's moat. It was the ultimate challenge. The night watchman and security team were on the lookout that night, as they were every night. They had driven past the polar bear enclosure at 5:15 that evening and again at 5:45. They were due back there 2 hours later as they patrolled the park. They were aware of break-ins during out-of-hours and often had to chase youngsters out of the park at night. So far, none had been stupid enough to breach any of the animal enclosure fences, but that was about to change. These 3 boys were up for the polar bear challenge, and each agreed to it. They stripped their clothes off, removing their trousers and shoes, ready for their daring swim. All 3 of them were giggling with excitement. They couldn't see the polar bears at the time as they were in their cave, but they knew they were in there. They just needed to scale the wrought iron fence and drop down on the other side. Then they needed to swim around the moat before climbing back out. That was the plan. It would be an excellent story to tell their friends. To have swum in the polar bear enclosure was only for the bravest of boys. 11-year-old Juan picked up all their clothes and threw them into the enclosure. There was no going back now. He began to climb the metal fence. He pulled himself upwards, scraping his hands on the bars. At the top, he managed to climb up and over the outwards pointing sharp metal points. He teetered on the top of the fence, waiting for his friends to catch him up. One of them backed down and remained on the ground, but the other scaled the fence with Juan. They looked down into the enclosure below. It was surrounded on 3 sides by the moat, had 8-foot iron fences around it, and was backed by a 20-foot cliff. The boys' clothes lay in a pile on the concrete. Juan dropped down, closely followed by his other friend. They were inside. They had made it. Now, the real challenge began. The dare was to swim in the moat. The 2 boys walked forwards, whilst their friend watched on the other side of the bars. Juan stepped into the moat, but his friend decided against it. It was too dangerous. He headed back to the fence, while Juan proceeded through the water. He half waded, half swam across to the other side. The water was cold. A shudder ran down his spine. By now, the commotion the boys had created had alerted the enclosure's residents. 1,200-pound, 540-kilogram Teddy and 900-pound, 400-kilogram Lucy. The bears stirred from their den and came outside to investigate. They lifted their heads upwards and sniffed the air. Then they turned and looked at the boys. They had been at the zoo for more than 20 years. Born in 1964 and transferred to the zoo the following year, that enclosure was all they had known. They had never encountered anyone else or anything else in their territory before, so this had come as a shock. How were they going to react in this new situation? Would their natural instincts kick in? By now, Juan had swum across the moat to the other side. He had climbed out and when he stood up, dripping wet, he saw the enormous polar bears. The first bear did nothing. It just stood, staring at the boy. But the other polar bear reacted differently. Upon spotting the intruder, the male polar bear immediately clambered down a rocky outcrop towards the boy. It lumbered towards him with the characteristic gait of a polar bear, its head swinging slightly from side to side, its huge paws placed carefully in front of it with each step. An impressive beast, powerful and strong. Juan felt the adrenaline surging through his veins. His heart thumped loudly in his ears. He felt sheer terror as the enormous predator came closer and closer. He froze, visibly shaking where he stood. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to hide. Instead, the small 11-year-old froze to the spot as the polar bear lunged at him. It grabbed him in its jaws and shook him violently. His friends screamed as they watched on in horror. The boys' cries were heard by staff at the zoo. They knew something terrible must have happened. Children had been sneaking into the zoo recently, and the security guards were constantly patrolling the zoo at night. It was now 7 p.m., 2 hours since the zoo had closed, and the blood-curdling screams meant only one thing, that someone was in serious trouble. They followed the sound of the desperate cries and dialed 911. As their friend was being mauled to death, the other two boys made a run for it, two partially naked boys fleeing into the night. When the zoo staff arrived at the polar bear exhibit, they could see the male polar bear dragging Juan's body across the enclosure. The boy was limp and lifeless. Emergency services and armed officers arrived on scene. What they found was deeply disturbing. There, just outside the polar bear den, were the two polar bears. Both were growling and fighting over the remains of the boy, tussling over the body. Only his upper half was left, and they pulled at it, each trying to keep it for themselves. It was a gruesome sight. There was no hope for the boy. It was clear to the officers that he was dead. They saw the pile of clothes scattered about on the ground and the blood on the polar bear's white fur. The scene they were faced with was deeply concerning. They suspected that there might be other children inside the enclosure. They found 3 pairs of trousers, a pair of trainers, and 2 unmatched shoes inside the compound. They thought more children might be hiding inside the cave, and so made the decision to shoot the bears. It took 20 blasts from 12-gauge shotguns firing rifled slugs and 6 bullets from a .38 caliber revolver to kill the bears. Finally, they fell to the ground, quiet and still. It was a sad end to their tragic lives. Protests broke out over the killing of the bears, and the zoo came under fire, as it had done so many times before, for its lack of welfare towards the animals in its care. That very same evening, at 11 p.m., an autopsy was performed on the bears. Officers and zoo staff wanted to make sure that they had only killed one child and not any more. They didn't yet understand the whole story. When they cut the bears open, they found the remains of Juan and no one else. When the bears were dead, they scoured the enclosure to check for more bodies, just to make sure no more were found. Later, the parents of Juan's 2 friends called police to inform them what had happened. That's when the 2 boys were interviewed and were able to reveal the true horror of the story, a silly dare that went horribly, horribly wrong. Prospect Park Zoo was closed to the public a year later, in 1988. The cages and pit enclosures were completely demolished, along with most of the interior buildings. The zoo had long needed an overhaul. The conditions the animals had been kept in for more than 50 years were appalling. Empty beer cans and smashed wine bottles were strewn about some of the enclosures. The animals were injured by their inadequate housing. There were reports of staff mistreating and even killing some of the animals. And now, finally, something was being done about it. During the renovation works, the animals were rehoused across America. Then, 5 years and $37 million later, the newly named Prospect Park Wildlife Conservation Center reopened. It was the fresh start the zoo needed. The conditions the animals were kept in were greatly improved, and the center had a new focus: to educate young people about wildlife and its conservation. A positive ending to an otherwise horrible story. swan, and 2 polar bears, meeting their preventable final affliction. It was whale migration season off the coast of Western Australia. Drawn towards their migration route, great white sharks are known to head northwards to meet the returning whales. This is often when the whales are most dangerous, as the shark population swells and they prowl the coastlines in greater numbers. One of the things known about great white sharks, and that is they are solitary hunters. They don't hunt in packs, a behavior that has been documented in other shark species. But that was about to change as passionate surfer 29-year-old Bradley Smith entered the water on July 10, 2004. From Shoalwater, 41 kilometers west of Australian state capital Perth, Bradley and a group of friends paddled out into the Indian Ocean. They were surfing at Left-Handers Beach, south of Gracetown, near Margaret River. The beach is a popular spot and is considered safe for more junior surfers. Nobody could have predicted what happened that day. As Bradley and his friends lay on their boards, floating on the surface of the ocean, not one, but 2 great white sharks prowled below the waves. Cooperative hunting is not documented in great white sharks, but these 2 clearly had their eyes on the same prize, the silhouetted figures of the surfers above them. After swimming along the coastline, the 2 sharks began to swim up through the water column. They headed directly for the surfers and began to power towards the surface. Bradley's friends looked over to see the terrifying shadow of a great white shark. It was so enormous that they described it as wide as a car. It was the megalodon of modern times, and it was heading straight for Bradley. Before anybody could get out of the way, there was suddenly an eruption of water right beside Bradley, and he was thrown off his board. The shark that made the hit was estimated to be 4.5 meters, almost 15 feet long. But that's when the group of friends spotted a second shark. When Bradley hit the water, he knew what was coming. He knew he had been struck by a shark and desperately grappled to get back onto his board. But the sharks were in attack mode. As the smaller of the 2, at 3 meters, 10 feet long, circled Bradley whilst he splashed in the water, the other came in for the kill, its dark shadow torpedoed below the other surfers heading straight for Bradley. His friends could only look on in horror as the dorsal fin sliced through the surface moments before it opened its jaws just feet from where Bradley trod water. Seconds later, the shark grabbed him, and he was pulled under the surface. The sharp, serrated teeth dug into his flesh, holding him in a vice-like grip. But Bradley was an incredibly brave young man and refused to give up. He thrashed around in the shark's jaws, hitting it and kicking with his legs. Miraculously, he made it back up to the surface as the shark let go for a moment. But Bradley wasn't dealing with just one shark. He was dealing with 2, and the blood that now poured from his open wounds incited the marine predators, and a feeding frenzy ensued. At that point, there was so much commotion in the water, so much splashing and bubbling and boiling, that it was impossible to tell which shark was attacking Bradley. It was a desperate fight for survival, and a devastating thing for his friends to witness. His mates, still on their surfboards just feet from where Bradley was being attacked, implored him to escape. With every fiber of their bodies, they willed him to make a break for it. "Swim for your life, mate," they shouted. "Swim for your life." That's exactly what Bradley was trying to do. But as each of the sharks came at him again and again, he couldn't fend them off. He kept punching them with his fists and pushing them away as their snouts broke through the surface right next to him. But it was a losing battle. One of his friends rushed to the shore and ran out of the water to call for help. He dialed 000 and turned to look back at the sea, shocked and shaken by what he had just witnessed. Seeing how enormous the sharks were and how intense their attack was, his friends knew Bradley was in the fight for his life. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. The 2 sharks had been on the hunt, and they had settled on Bradley as their prey. It was such a rapid and ferocious attack by 2 absolutely giant sharks that at one point, when one of the sharks opened its jaws to bite Bradley, an eyewitness described the jaws as wide as the length of a man's arm. The shark could have swallowed Bradley whole. With both great whites furiously biting, tugging, and pulling at the young man, his body was practically torn in two. After 45 seconds of relentless attacking, there was a break in the feeding frenzy, and Bradley's body floated on the surface, motionless. His friends seized their opportunity. With the two man-eaters just feet away, they frantically paddled over to Bradley, who was now surrounded in a dark cloud of red seawater. Bravely, his friends grabbed hold of him. He was no longer moving. He no longer had any fight left in him. He had bled out from the attack just yards from dry land, and only feet from some of his best friends. As the friends pulled Bradley towards the shoreline, he left a trail of blood behind them. It was tantalizing for the two sharks, and the short paddle to the beach felt like an eternity as the friends thought that they might be next. Not daring to look behind them, they focused on the shore and the safety of the beach. Finally, they made it to the shallows and dragged Bradley out of the water. With the friends too traumatized to describe Bradley's injuries, another eyewitness told media that Bradley had been torn in half. It's something that you may see in the movies, but you never for 1 second think that it is something that is going to happen to one of your best friends. Bradley's board was brought to shore afterwards. It had been completely snapped in half by the shark's razor-sharp teeth. The bite mark was testament to just how massive the great whites had been. Following the harrowing tragedy, marksmen in a flotilla of boats who were accompanied by a police helicopter scoured the ocean for the two man-eating giants. Normally, great white sharks are protected, and it is forbidden to hunt them. But fisheries officer Tony Capilouti said that if a shark poses a significant threat to humans and has attacked before, then officers are always authorized to kill it. As the search party headed out into the surf, there was no sign of the two sharks. They had likely been scared off by the sound of the engines and the commotion. But there was dispute amongst many Australians. As is often the case after an attack, the debate about whether or not to kill those responsible arose. Shark nets that are installed along some stretches of the Australian coast are not considered effective and pose significant risk to other marine life. Authorities worry that if a shark has tasted human blood, then they may be more likely to attack people again. But a few days after the attack, words of support for the two sharks were spoken by the most unlikely of people, Bradley's brother. He said that a revenge killing wasn't going to bring his brother back, and it's not what Bradley would have wanted. An uneasiness came over locals when a week passed and no sign of the two enormous sharks was found. They had vanished from the coastal waters, and with the ability to travel more than 100 miles a day, the search area was now huge. Marine experts were surprised by the behavior of the two sharks. Eyewitnesses reported one shark knocking Bradley off the board and the other coming in to attack him. It seemed like a collaborative hunt, something else that added to the uneasiness of the locals. But for most avid surfers, the terrible attack wasn't going to stop them going into the water. When the very same beach was reopened following the tragedy, surfers were back out in the waves. They knew the dangers, and their love for the sport far outweighed any fear they may have of being eaten by a shark and meeting their own final affliction. Komodo dragons are the stuff of nightmares, with a mouth full of sharp, serrated teeth to tear flesh from bone, a long forked tongue that can smell its prey from 5 miles away, and a venom that causes the victim to internally bleed to death. They are one of the most feared reptiles on the planet. There are thought to be only 4,000 Komodo dragons left in the wild. They inhabit just 5 Indonesian islands, which are Komodo, Rinca, Flores, Gili Dasami, and Gili Motang. They are renowned as carrion eaters, tucking into carcasses and consuming up to 80% of their body weight in one sitting. However, when the opportunity arises, they are also exceptional ambush predators. Typically, they prey on small animals such as invertebrates, birds, reptiles, eggs, and monkeys. Larger dragons will eat wild boar, goats, deer, horses, and even water buffalo. They have a disturbing habit of digging up graves and feeding on the corpses beneath. This has led locals to bury their dead in clay soils and pile rocks on top to prevent the lizards from gaining access to their loved ones. It is no wonder the Komodo dragons have such a fearsome reputation. It is what drives tourists to the Indonesian islands, the chance to see the largest and heaviest lizards in the world. In March 2009, 31-year-old Muhammad Anwar set out to pick fruit on the island of Komodo. Nobody knows for sure what happened leading up to the attack, but the following story is thought to be the most probable scenario of what happened to him on that fateful day. It was a warm, sunny day, and as Muhammad walked through the groves, his scent was picked up by a pair of Komodo dragons that were on the prowl. Due to habitat destruction, Komodo dragons are becoming increasingly more problematic for humans as they search further to find food. Amongst the fruit trees, the giant lizards flicked their forked tongues in and out. The chemoreceptors on the roof of their mouths alerted them to a meal several hundred meters away. Silently, they closed in. Their heavy footsteps were silent in the tall grass. Their heads swayed from side to side. Muhammad was unaware of his impending doom. Conflicting reports suggest that he was either working in the fields as a fruit picker or he was trespassing. Komodo National Park's general manager, Franciscus Harum, said that it was forbidden to go into that area of the park and that Muhammad was a fisherman who had strayed from the beach to search for fruit. There was a reason the area was forbidden to enter. It was home to a large population of Komodo dragons and was deemed too dangerous for the general public. But others believed he was working in one of the fruit groves there, picking apples to provide for his family. In Komodo, besides the tourism industry, fruit picking and fishing provide the main income for locals. Whatever his reason for being there, Muhammad was about to find himself in a sticky situation. The 31-year-old climbed the apple tree. He hauled himself up through the branches, reaching the choicest fruit at the top of the tree and placing it into his bag. He was about to climb back down and climb another tree when he spotted something on the ground. It was large, a flash of dark green and gray. He lowered himself down slightly, holding on with both his hands as he peered through the branches. Then his heart leapt in his chest as he realized he was surrounded by not one, but two Komodo dragons. They were enormous, weighing around 70 kilograms or 150 pounds, and stretching to 2.5 meters or 8.5 feet long. He watched intently as he contemplated his next move. He decided to wait it out, but the Komodo dragons weren't just passing by. They were there for him. He was their prey. The scent of the young man had enticed them from the tree line. They were searching for their next meal, and at last they had found it. One of them reared up on its hind legs and placed its front claws on the tree trunk. Muhammad felt the trunk shake under the weight of the lizard as it leaned against it, supported by its thick, muscular tail. He knew they could climb trees. There was very little a Komodo dragon couldn't do. Not only could they ascend trees, but they were excellent swimmers, could run at speeds of up to 12 miles per hour, and females could reproduce without involving a male. To Muhammad's relief, however, this one was too heavy to climb up the tree and lowered itself back down to the ground. But he was stuck. The animals below him circled the tree. He watched them, observing their characteristic lumbering gait. Every now and then they would pause and look upwards, eyeing the young man with interest. The tongues flicked in and out of their mouths. He could see their armored, scaly skin and their powerful tails. He cried out, hoping that some of the other workers would hear him, but nobody answered. He was torn. Should he make a run for it, or should he try and wait it out? As the heat of the day drained him and sweat poured from his face, he shuffled uneasily on the branch he was perched on. With only apples to keep him hydrated, he knew his options were limited. He readjusted his grip on one of the branches, but as he did so, his sweaty palm slipped on the smooth bark of the apple tree, and he lost his footing. Muhammad went crashing to the ground. He was whipped and smacked by the other branches as he plummeted downwards. The wind was knocked from his lungs as he landed on the hard ground. Then they were upon him. Muhammad had no time to get up. He immediately felt the hungry meat-eaters tearing into his flesh. It was like a feeding frenzy. Each of their mouths contained 60 serrated teeth designed for tearing through meat and causing severe damage and exsanguination. The force of their bite could break a man's leg in two. They were merciless. At last, their long wait for a meal was over. The two dragons hissed as they attacked their victim. Muhammad cried out in pain. He desperately tried to fight the lizards off, but their frenzied attack gave him no room to maneuver. Eventually, Theresia Tawa heard the desperate cries for help and ran through the fruit grove. When she reached Muhammad, she was shocked at the sight. Blood poured from the young man's body. He was thrashing about on the ground, kicking and punching and screaming. He was fighting back as hard as he could. Theresia threw stones at the giant lizards and yelled at them. They paused momentarily and looked up. Theresia screamed at them again, and they scuttled off into the undergrowth. She rushed to Muhammad's side and cradled his head in her hands. Large, gaping wounds had been torn by their teeth. The venom was now coursing through his body, preventing the blood from clotting. Soon muscle paralysis, hypothermia, shock, and loss of consciousness would set in. Muhammad needed urgent medical attention if he had any chance of survival, but hospitals were few and far between on the Indonesian islands. He was carried to the shore and lifted into a fisherman's motorboat. They sped across the water to a medical clinic on the nearby island of Flores. Tragically, Muhammad died on arrival at the clinic from massive blood loss before doctors were able to save him. This tragic incident was one of many increasing attacks across the islands, only adding to the fear that surrounds the endangered reptiles. Only the month before, a dragon climbed up a ladder and into the house of a park ranger, mauling him whilst he slept. Although he survived, it was a harrowing experience. The previous year, 5 tourists were swept onto the island of Rinca after being caught by strong currents whilst diving. Arriving on the soft sand in the dead of night, they didn't realize that their ordeal was just beginning. As sunlight emerged, they came face to face with a Komodo dragon and spent 5 days fending it off whilst waiting for rescue. And a couple of years before that, an 8-year-old local boy was pounced upon by a dragon whilst playing football with his friends. Sadly, he didn't live to tell the tale. An increasing number of encounters are thought to be due to the loss of the Komodo dragon's habitat. As more of it is cleared to make way for agriculture and housing, the giant lizards have no choice but to search elsewhere for food. Living in such close proximity to people is bound to end in conflict. They are drawn to the rural communities by the promise of food. Domesticated goats and chickens are easy meals for the lizards, and although humans aren't their typical prey, they will attack if they feel threatened or if they are really, really hungry. The Komodo dragons who attacked Muhammad that day were apparently just that, leading to his terrifying final affliction.